Don't do that, please.
Why?
Oh, please, don't do that.
What are you doing, freak?
Ça ne saute pas forcément aux yeux de prime abord, mais Jersey Affair, traduction absurde du très beau titre anglais Beast, est largement inspiré d'histoires vraies et même de la vie du cinéaste Michael Pearce, qui signe ici son premier film.
It's loosely based on a true case. There was a guy called the Beast of Jersey who committed a lot of really horrific crimes in the 1960s. And I grew up in Jersey, and even when I grew up in the 80s, he was still a kind of spectre that haunted the island. I suppose I learned about him at that age where there's a kind of loss of innocence when you realise that monsters do exist. They're not just in the fairy tale books, they could be your next door neighbour. I suppose I investigate my impressions of the island and I magnified them through the kind of prism of a fairy tale. In some ways I started to see the film as a fairy tale. It's about a seemingly innocent young woman trapped within a hostile family environment, and she goes into the woods and meets a character that might be Prince Charming or might be the big bad wolf.
Vous l'aurez déjà compris, les splendides paysages de l'île de Jersey occupent une place très importante dans ce thriller poétique.
Traditionally, I think as thrillers, you try and draw tension from the landscape. In Britain, we have a great tradition of that with Gothic literature and in movies. What struck me about this true case was that it seemed so incongruous, that something so evil could happen in such a beautiful and quaint setting. And that was a big impression. I wanted to hold on to that. So when we were making the film, we didn't try and make the landscape tense or foreboding. We in fact tried to do the opposite.
Le ressenti du cinéaste vis-à-vis de son île natale a également conditionné l'une des grandes dynamiques du film.
It's a very wild landscape in some ways. It's very untouched. And I found that as a child very freeing and very liberating. But in another way, I mean, especially when I was a teenager, I really wanted to escape. And it also has quite a sort of conservative culture, and it's quite affluent.
Jersey Affair va donc faire s'affronter la nature sauvage et l'étouffante communauté locale.
In some ways, the film is a sort of prison break movie. This is a young woman that's trapped within an island. She's trapped within a hostile family setting, within a dysfunctional relationship with her mother, and she's trapped by her own guilt. And she meets this man that might be dangerous, but paradoxically, he's able to break her free from these multiple prisons.
Michael Pearce va donc juxtaposer dans son film des intérieurs étouffants à des extérieurs libérateurs.
I'd like to make a toast.
When we have scenes of Mole where she's trapped within the family or within the community, we're very specific with the framing. We use slow tracks, slow zooms, and the editing is also much more sort of paced and deliberate. When there's the scenes of her and Pascal falling in love, most of that's done in handheld. Often it's set outdoors, we use a much more natural light, and even the editing becomes much more impressionistic. There's a moment in the film where she breaks free from the shackles of her family, and at that moment we begin to cut back and forth at different times where she's breaking free of the family at the golf club, to some waves exploding, to her moving into the house. We don't know whether this has all taken place over 24 hours or a week, but at that moment it doesn't matter. Time sort of conflates, and it's more about the feeling of these two people being bonded together.
Toujours dans cette volonté de décaler le récit d'une réalité immédiatement identifiable, Michael Pearce avait une vision très précise de la direction artistique de son film.
We did a lot of work in the art direction and costume to give some kind of nostalgic feeling, something that was timeless, that it could have happened in the 60s or the 70s without it being kitsch. If we got the right balance, the audience wouldn't notice it, but we would be creating a platform for the fable, for the fairy tale-like qualities of the film to sort of emanate from.
Everything you've done for me, I forgive you. Get out. it.
Tous ces principes d'écriture, de direction artistique et de mise en scène convergent au final vers un objectif, créer avec Moll une anti-héroïne fascinante, interprétée par une Jessie Buckley absolument incroyable.
We were so lucky to have Jessie. Even from the very first day, the very first take, she started at such a high level. It kind of set the barometer so high for the other actors, all of the crew, and for me. We all need to be at this level that Jessie's operating at. Very quickly, she's able to turn on the electrical charge of her character, and she goes from 0 to 100 kind of immediately. And also, she has a very empathetic and grounded soul. I thought it was necessary to cast someone that we connect to, even when she makes her worst mistakes. I struggle to think of characters in terms of heroes and villains, because that doesn't capture the complexity of who we are. My personal philosophy to creating characters is that if you don't empathize with them as a director, you haven't tried hard enough to understand your characters. And if you don't see their flaws and their mistakes, you haven't looked deep enough into them.
And you keep a secret?